Thank you, Mrs. McCain and President Crow. I'm truly honored to be serving as a non-resident fellow in national security at the McCain Institute and to be with you at the Sedona Forum this year. In 2018, as I left government service as director of the National Counterterrorism Center, I joined the McCain Institute to launch a new national security and counterterrorism program at the Institute. And as I thought about where we could have immediate and positive impact on real-world problems, I settled very quickly on the challenge of prevention. By prevention work, I mean the effort to prevent acts of targeted violence or terrorism rather than having to respond after those horrible acts have already happened. What can we as a society do to build protective capabilities and capacity in individuals and in groups and in entire communities to prevent individuals from being radicalized to the point where targeted violence results? How do we do that work proactively rather than reactively? My thinking was that we had to find new tools to use that went beyond simply law enforcement tools. The FBI, as good as it is, cannot track and surveil everybody who might be a potential extremist or even a terrorist. We can't arrest our way out of this problem here in America. And my own experience in government in the prevention area had been a mixed one. We had smart, dedicated people doing great work in this field of prevention, reaching out to communities all across the country to share information and help create that capacity I mentioned a minute ago. It was also clear that the federal government alone was not going to solve this problem, not even close. This problem went way beyond Washington. It was going to take state and local governments beyond the Beltway. It was going to take community-based organizations around the country, and it was going to take civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations. And I was determined that the McCain Institute try to do its part to develop solutions that would keep communities safe and indeed keep our democracy safe from violent extremism. So with that broad goal in mind, I asked my friend and colleague Brette Steele to build a preventing targeted violence program for the McCain Institute. And she has done just that in a period of just 2 short years. Brette is a proven thought leader, an innovator, and a genuine subject matter expert in this emerging discipline of prevention work. She's one of the very best and most accomplished professionals in this field. And she has assembled today for this panel a world-class set of prevention-focused colleagues to share their expertise with you. Make no mistake, this is difficult, complicated work, and it's often very hard to measure whether we're succeeding at what we are doing. But we're currently facing a growing national security crisis of targeted violence and terrorism across the United States. The threat is urgent and it's pervasive. In fact, I would argue there are few, if any, issues on this Sedona Forum agenda that are any more urgent than this one. We need more tools and more money to help communities intervene and interrupt the process where somebody becomes radicalized. The demand for prevention work is skyrocketing. We also need academic research drawing on real data that allows for evidence-based approaches to a problem that often is not solved in a way that is entirely intuitive. And perhaps most importantly, these prevention activities must be carried out in a way that doesn't stigmatize or alienate the very communities we are trying to keep safe. So with that, I will stop and make way for Brette and that expert panel she has assembled. I guarantee that what you will hear today will make you think hard about whether we are doing enough as a country and whether we're acting with sufficient urgency as a society to deal with extremism and terrorism domestically. When it comes to protecting our democracy and to ensuring the safety of our communities, we don't want to fall short in that regard. Thank you, and please enjoy the panel discussion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brette Steele, and I serve as Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. I would like to thank Mrs. McCain and the Institute for including this timely panel on preventing future attacks on our democracy in the Sedona Forum this year. Our panelists today include Richard Aborn, Vidhya Ramalingam, and Tony Sgro. We're going to jump right in here. The attack on the Capitol on January 6th shocked many Americans and raised awareness of domestic violent extremism within the United States. I've invited you here today because you are some of the leading luminaries on preventing targeted violence and terrorism across the country. how do you distinguish between prevention and traditional law enforcement tactics that our audience may be more familiar with? Richard, do you want to go ahead and start us off here?
Sure, Brett, happy to. So I actually come out of law enforcement. I was a prosecutor for many years, so I understand that space quite well. Law enforcement is about identifying, building evidence, interdicting, arresting, and prosecuting. Prevention is actually about the opposite. Prevention is doing whatever we can as a society to make sure that people do not engage in criminality. So the police respond post-criminality, we try to respond pre-criminality. And I think that's the primary difference. Many of us follow a public health model, which is increasingly being seen as a viable way to approach prevention. And many of us also engage in both prevention and intervention, which is a distinction that we probably should also talk about at some point in this panel.
Richard, do you want to go ahead and introduce that concept of intervention now?
Sure. So in the organization I run, the Crime Commission, we think of prevention as being a geographically widespread effort to stop people from engaging in criminality at all. If they begin to think about it, grab onto one of the prevention techniques that we or many others provide and do not engage in that conduct. That's prevention. It prevents the act from taking place. Intervention is when you intervene in what is a, hopefully slowly, but sometimes rapidly growing piece of criminal conduct in an attempt to get the person to disengage from that criminal conduct before they reach a level of mobilization, to introduce a third word, which causes law enforcement to take a more vigorous stance as to whether or not they need to arrest or not. We also apply intervention in this space, in the terrorism space, post-arrest. So we have dealt with individuals that have been arrested on terrorism charges, but whom we think really are being driven by some either mental health issue or some deep emotional driver, as opposed to a strict adherence to an ideology. We, with the leave of the court, will actually intervene with those people, take those people through a long behavioral health program, and then try and get them back out on the streets with a well-adjusted mental state so they're not attracted to that lifestyle again.
Thank you for that, Richard. Vidhya or Tony, is there anything you want to add on kind of distinguishing prevention, what we're here to talk about today, versus some of the more traditional law enforcement tactics?
The only thing I might add, Brett, is, for me, prevention is, of course, about ensuring that people don't take this path, but then that related concept of intervention that Richard mentioned, for me, it's really about recognition that change is possible. There are, of course, some individuals in America that are genuinely planning or have carried out violence or are currently inciting violence and hate against communities. And the criminal justice and law enforcement system need to be equipped to handle those cases. But my firm belief is that anyone below that line, anyone who has not yet crossed that line where law enforcement engagement is warranted, anyone below that line is someone that I want to try and change. And it's really important for us to see behaviors as sitting along a spectrum, because the intervention looks very different based on where someone sits along that spectrum.
Right. And Tony, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, I'm going to pick up on a word that Vidhya said, behaviors. Representing the youth market of approximately 30 million young people, we know that they potentially have very high propensity to radicalize. They're exploring, and it could be the good and the bad and the ugly. If we get to them when they're impacting and developing their behaviors as young people, we prevent the tsunami of hate and violence from happening. So yes, agreed.
All right, thank you all. So now I want to turn to the work you're doing and help kind of situate the audience and help them understand what is one program you're either running now or you've run recently to prevent violent extremism that you think shows a lot of promise. And Vidhya, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. I know you've been running a program in the last 6 months that's really fascinating. I was wondering if you could introduce your organization and walk us through some of what you found.
Sure, thanks, Brett. So as an organization, Moonshot runs programs aiming to reach out directly to audiences that are at risk of violent extremism, that are getting involved in violent extremism online, and offer safer alternatives. And over the years, one clear learning for us as we've been running programs both across the US and also globally to engage with these audiences, one clear learning for us is that across the spectrum, audiences are most receptive to what I'd call non-ideological interventions rather than explicit counter-narratives, so explicit content which tries to undermine the ideology. And that's not to say that challenging the ideology isn't important, because it is important to do that. But when trying to identify the best entry point into engagement with someone who is getting involved in an extremist organization or getting involved with the ideology, we tend to find that essentially social work approaches tend to be most effective. And we ran tests on this in the US several years ago now, about 3 years ago, and we found that far-right extremists were 48% more likely to engage with essentially self-help content, psychosocial content, than the general public when we offered that same content to the general public. And if they were looking to join a violent group, like looking to join the KKK, for example, they were 115% more likely than the general public to engage with that content. And we've tested this same approach with Islamist extremist audiences as well, and found similar rates. Islamist extremist audiences globally were 47% more likely than the general public to engage with, again, that kind of self-help psychosocial support content. And earlier this year, if I think about this even in a non-Western setting, earlier this year, we released some data showing that in our tests in Indonesia, we saw audiences engaging with violent extremist groups online were 128% more likely to engage with psychosocial content as compared to how they would engage with clearly ideological counter content, so content which would explicitly undermine the ideology. So this trend seems to hold in nearly every geography we try it. So in the US, it was about 7 months ago now, back in September, as the context started to become more polarized and as the risk of violence increased surrounding the election and also through to the events this year, we prioritize testing non-ideological de-escalation messages. So messages aiming to take audiences that were specifically, hyped up and angry and considering violence, and try and de-escalate that from that point of taking that kind of action. So we focused on 4 audiences. It was armed group members, white supremacists, QAnon adherents, and then individuals consuming violence-oriented election disinformation. And we've been running campaigns ever since that period to reach these audiences across different online platforms. And when I think about what seems to be working, the most engaging of our messages that we tested with these audiences began with the statement, "Anger and grief can be isolating." So on average, those 4 audiences were 17% more likely to click on that particular message than any of the other messages, any of the other counter messages we tested. And in particular, armed group audiences, so these are people that are engaging directly with armed group content online, they were most likely to engage with messages that said things like, "Don't do something you'll regret. Self-control is key." And even in some cases offering essentially mindfulness exercises to aiming to de-escalate someone from anger. We also found that those audiences, the armed group audiences, were very receptive to what I'd call basically American identity messages, positive American identity messages. So messages, one of the ads we tested said, "When you make yourself better, you learn how to make America better. Learn how." And we're essentially trying to mix patriotism with self-care and self-help and non-violence messaging. Interestingly, the QAnon audiences in particular, they engaged most with advertising that acknowledged their anger and their emotional state, essentially. So one of the messages we tested was, "Are you feeling angry?" And it said, "You're not alone, learn how to escape the anger and move forward." And we were offering them some content to try and de-escalate someone from considering violence as a next step to dealing with their anger. So these are some of the learnings from our initial 7 months of programming. But really importantly, we started to work with partners to set up what was essentially a 24/7 text messaging support line. We were working with Crisis Text Line to set up a dedicated hotline where users could text in and speak to a counselor at any time of the day to access immediate support. And we had this running through the January 6th insurrection. We offered crisis counseling to more than 270,000 high-risk internet users during the January 6th insurrection in DC. And we've had well over 70,000 engagements with that campaign. It's ongoing now, so we'll continue to, to look into the data around efficacy and also around conversions to counseling sessions. But one of the reasons why we're so interested in how psychosocial support content is resonating is we're also seeing right now, especially as QAnon is fragmenting and as disillusion's rising within QAnon networks, as people are realizing the prophecies were false, we're seeing a lot of audience members online talking about essentially about their state of fraying mental health, people who have lost their jobs, connections to their family members, they alienated themselves from their communities, and we're seeing heightened levels of conversation around expressing essentially extreme anxiety and even suicidal thought. So, some of these communities are really hurting right now. And as much as we may loathe what they stand for, and as much as we want to change their paths, they're hurting. And there's an opportunity now to ensure that we're there and that we get there before extremist actors get to them and try and take advantage of that vulnerable state. We want to reach them first and ensure that we're offering them a path out. So, and this is one of the reasons why we'll continue to have that focus on psychosocial support, on delivering interventions through that non-ideological methodology, and we'll continue to monitor impact.
Thank you for that, Vidhya. It's truly fascinating to see all that you're finding through this. And frankly, violent extremism is a problem where we don't see large base rates normally. And so you have the opportunity to get much more representative findings with kind of the larger pool of people that's consuming this content right now. A lot of promise there. Tony, I wanted to turn next to you, and I have the pleasure of working with you very closely through multiple partnerships. So I was wondering if you could kind of introduce your academic partnership model to the audience and give us some examples of promising programs and projects that you're seeing right now.
Great, my pleasure. Thank you, Brett. It started when I received a phone call in 2014 from the National Security Council. They were familiar with the work that EdVenture Partners does in developing partnerships with universities around the world. And they said, we have a crazy idea. Do you think it's possible to get faculty interested to where they would mission their students to develop counter-messaging campaigns against ISIS and other violent extremism organizations? And Brett, my chin hit the floor. I could not believe that I was being asked to take our model, which had worked for Honda and AT&T and others, for social impact. So we piloted a program, the acronym loosely, peer-to-peer. And the first semester was enough of a success. And from what the government said, ungovernment-like, which was really important, it really blossomed to where we have implemented programs in 425 different universities in 76 countries. And fast forward, let me explain what happens. So we will find a faculty member at the university who teaches either international relations, political science, peace, conflict, terrorism studies, technology and media, or it could be marketing, advertising, integrated marketing communications, social media, video production. A class of between 5 to 50 students become a social digital media agency. They form into cross-functional departments. There's advertising, app development, budget, graphic design, social media, research, public relations, video production, strategy. It's the real deal. They get between 50 and 100% of a grade assigned to the project. So the students first identify a target audience that they think is going to be the focus of their messaging campaigns. They do research, which validates the strategy, and then they present it to us, Brett, as you know, in a project concept report. One thing we learned from the beginning, never say no. Who are we to say, me sitting in Northern California, that somebody in Boston or in Berlin thinks this is the way to address targeted violence and hate? But what we will do is raise the bar of performance. So we will guide them to raise the bar of what they're thinking to implement a successful campaign. Then what we do, which is really unusual in education, is we give them $1,000. And that really changes the dynamics of learning because it's real. This is not an exercise in thinking, it's an exercise in doing. So they will implement an initiative, product, or tool to address targeted violence and hate on their campuses and in their communities. And it is experiential learning, project-based learning, action-based learning at its finest. Students do things that are tangible and real. We have competitions. Pre-COVID, we would have teams come to different parts of the world and present. Now, as you know, we do virtual competitions and it's great, but we look forward to the new normal where we can actually have students present live to judges. We started working with the McCain Institute as your partner on the Protective Project in the fall of 2020. And we did 2 semesters. And I just want to call attention to 2 campaigns that were really good and also to prove a point. So we asked students to develop a campaign to address hate and school-based violence. 2 of the top 3 teams decided the focus of their effort was going to be against incels, or involuntary celibates. We deliberately leave the objectives broad to allow for various interpretations. So Arizona State took incels. Their campaign, called Insight was a way to build empathy, understanding with angry young men who have a gripe and blame women on their ability to get dates. They're very violent. The team at Arizona State created their campaign based upon an incel shooting where 3 people were actually injured. Their campaign was based upon storytelling. So people could post on this website about how to address isolation, loneliness, as a way to reaching potential behaviors that'll move somebody to violence as an incel. Now flip the coin. Missouri State University did the same thing, incels, but what they ended up doing is developing an innovative methodology to reach 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders. Way down in the career and behaviors ladder as a way to try to instill values and learnings that ultimately would prevent young men from becoming incels. They had a really fun interactive video. They had lesson plans. So that's a good example with the McCain program that we worked together. And then that served as the cursor to a program with the McCain Institute and EdVenture partners that we're managing currently for the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Terrorism Prevention and Targeted Violence, called Invent to Prevent. And we have 25 universities participating right now, coast to coast. And some of the campaigns, Brett, as you know, are simply remarkable. I mean, we're trying to decide, we kind of talk offhandedly, who's going to make the finalists. There's so many remarkable campaigns. And I just want to call attention to a couple. First, the themes tend to be bucketed around community building, technology, tech innovation, protective factors, and really because of what happened in DC in January, media literacy, fake news, disinformation, critical thinking. So at Johns Hopkins University, they have a campaign called My Bias, which means Balanced Information Assessment Scale. And it's a 23-question personality quiz where, you know, Myers-Briggs does personality. This does what's your propensity to be misled by disinformation. So you take this quiz and it's not easy. It's a really challenging quiz. And ultimately, at the end of the 23 questions, a character will pop up and say, you are Randall. And here is Randall's profile when it comes to media literacy, misinformation, lack of source verification. And it gives you tools and readings that will allow somebody to increase their media literacy. We find out of the 25 programs that are happening right now, 1/3 are based around media literacy, critical thinking, source verification, as a way to prevent what happened at the Capitol, impacting democracy. And there are elements of greatness in all the campaigns. And I have many more examples, but I think that just gives you a sense of the possibility when you engage young people to be part of the solution, because they're the first to know, often before law enforcement, of the ills that are brewing in their communities. And this whole model is based upon peer influence.
Thank you, Tony. And I should say, since we are the McCain Institute for International Leadership, we've also been invited by the State Department to replicate this program in France this semester. So we have 4 universities participating in France right now as well.
That's right.
So Richard, now I want to turn to you. The Citizens Crime Commission of New York has a long history in addressing intractable problems, and specifically gang violence among them. And you've really done a lot of work to adapt models that have worked in other contexts to this challenge of violent extremism. Wanted to give you a chance to address how the Citizens Crime Commission of New York is addressing this challenge.
Thank you, Brett. It's interesting, if you listen to Vidhya and Tony, and now coupled with what I'm about to say, you're going to begin to see a continuum here on a continuum of approaches to violence and closeness to violence. The work that Vidhya and Tony are doing is critically important. It embraces, government has a way of saying we have to have a whole of government approach. In this space, we need a whole of society approach, and we need to have interventions at all the various stages of a person's pathway to violence, from trying to stop it in the very beginning to intervening with it if it does begin. At the Crime Commission, which has been around since Teddy Roosevelt was the first commissioner of the NYPD, that's how long it's been around, we are tasked with developing innovative ideas to try and prevent the most extreme forms of violence. And as Brett said, that takes us to gang violence, high-risk gang members, illegal guns, gun trafficking, and extremism, both domestic extremism and international terrorism. If I may draw one fine distinction here, which is relevant to this conversation, in addition to defining the word prevention as being different from the word intervention, there's also a subset of prevention which we practice, and that's called precision prevention. And what that means is we focus on those actors that show the highest likelihood of actually engaging in a violent act, that they are very close to engaging in a violent act, absent some intervention, which is what we provide. So our program receives referrals from the FBI, the NYPD Intelligence Division, the US Attorney's offices in New York, and 2 of the district attorney's offices, those being the entities that arrest and prosecute terrorism cases. We receive referrals from them of individuals who have begun to exhibit signs of getting ready to engage in terrorism. And I can give you a whole long explanation of what some of those signs look like. They are then referred to us. We have a long engagement with them in which we analyze whether or not we think they're suitable for the intervention that we have developed. And then assuming they pass that test, we actually bring them in as a participant. We then spend anywhere from 6 to 12 to 18 months with that person, getting that person to focus on those emotional drivers that may be making him feel attracted to extreme violence. Now, I want to pause there and pick up on something Vidhya said, but although say it in just a slightly different way, but it's the same point. We are not a de-radicalization program. Yes, occasionally, as Vidhya said, you have to talk about ideology, but we do not focus on the ideology. We focus on the emotional drivers. We are here to help that person understand those things within their own psychological composition, the various things they've experienced in their lives that will help them reject the violence they're about to engage with. Now, this is important because my belief is, and we spent 2 years developing this program, that if you try and engage in an ideological centered conversation around someone who's attracted to a particular ideology, I promise you, I don't care how smart you are, 99.9% chance you're going to lose. Not only are you going to lose the argument, but you're going to further de-radicalize the person, and you're going to lose any chance of bringing that person back. So we do not do that. We do not engage in that conduct at all. We focus on those emotional drivers.
And Richard, sorry to interrupt, but you mean they're going to double down, right?
They're going to drive them towards it.
Yeah,
you're going to lose them. You're going to lose them, meaning you are going to actually enhance. I've had this experience in the gun space as well. You're actually going to enhance the chance that they act out, and the Hippocratic Oath is the first thing we all need to be practicing here. The first thing is let's do no harm. So we worry a lot about that. Now, why is this work important? everybody knows that law enforcement has been very fond of saying that they have lots of people that come up on their radar screen, but they cannot possibly intervene with every single person, but they don't know what to do. We become that something to do. And in fact, much like Tony, this program was developed in a response to a call from the National Security Division at DOJ, asking us to engage in the work necessary to adapt our gang interventions into this space. And if you want, we can get into a discussion about why those interventions are different. But this is intervening with an individual just before they become violent. We're trying to stop that last step before they become violent.
All right, thank you, Richard. So I am going to dive a little deeper here because we've got a little bit of time and I want our audience to understand, how do we know what are the behavioral indicators we're seeing? And Vidhya, I know your work speaks to this as well. How do you know when it's appropriate to intervene with a person online? When are you finding those targeted advertisements most relevant? What is that concerning behavior you're seeing that leads you to say, yes, this is someone who we would like to intervene with? And Richard, same to you. What behaviors lead to those referrals? How do you know when there's a person of concern, and how do you know when your work might have an impact? Vidhya, I'll let you start on this.
Sure. Yeah. For us as an organization, we focus exclusively on behavioral indicators. So we're not looking at the socio-demographic background of any individual. We're not making any judgments based on who they are. We're just looking at what someone is doing online. And in particular, if someone is posting content which is using racial slurs and slogans and content that's generally affiliated with neo-Nazi organizations, for example, if someone is watching videos that were posted by an armed group, if someone is engaging with content online which is affiliated in some way or indicates sympathy in some way with extremist ideologies, that's when we're concerned. Now, what we try and do is we try as much as possible to distinguish between individuals online that are just maybe demonstrating an interest, have maybe just started looking into this content, versus individuals that are really posting incitement to violence and are genuinely engaging in activity online, which indicates that they have an interest in in perpetrating harm. And we try as much as possible to distinguish between the two on the basis of how those individuals are using or engaging with those indicators. So the way that we tend to identify those audiences, the way we tend to, I mentioned that we serve audiences advertisements, is, for example, if someone enters into Google a particular string of keywords which indicates that they're looking to access violent content, if they're looking to access instructions around how to carry out violence, or if they're looking to access information around how to join an extremist organization, we might also then serve our ad to someone who, again, as I mentioned, has watched a video that's affiliated with an armed group.
So again, as I said in my first comments, you're going to see a continuum here. So we start with individuals, much like Vidhya has mentioned, who are looking at extremist material, but then we look for additional factors to see whether or not they're advancing down the pathway to actual violence. So we often have referrals from people who have maybe traveled to a foreign jurisdiction in an effort to reach jihadi controlled territory. We have referrals of individuals who maybe have interacted with an undercover or an enforcement and are making plans to engage in a violent act. We have individuals who have in some ways exhibited signs of, in legal terms, what's called lending material support to the enemy. These are all people that have taken very overt steps towards acting on the violence that they are orally describing, either online or in recorded in-person conversations. Almost in every instance except one, law enforcement has intervened because the conduct is so serious. But, and this is the important distinction, law enforcement quickly, and we spend a lot of time helping law enforcement recognize this, recognizes that the person may be driven by some mental health issue as opposed to a real allegiance to an ideology. And that, in a sense, is our sweet spot. Our sweet spot is those people who are showing all the external signs of mobilizing towards real terrorism, real extremism, mass shooters, etc. But we've trained law enforcement to begin to recognize that some of it's a mental health issue. I'm talking about in New York, not law enforcement nationwide. And that's where we come in. We even get referrals from courts, from federal courts, for people who may have gone through the system, who probably don't need jail, but have some real mental health issues, which, if not addressed, would result in the person acting out in violence. And I should note that within the last week, and Brett, you and I haven't even discussed this yet, within the last week, we've developed a new series of protocols to actually start working with people while they are incarcerated. And that's particularly important, both in terms of getting us the ability to develop a relationship with the person while they're still in custody of the government, so that we can advise a court as to whether or not we think it's appropriate, or advise the U.S. attorney whether or not it's appropriate for that person to be released and go into our program. It's also very important that, because people who are being convicted of terrorism are not getting life sentences, and that's a harsh reality we need to deal with. They may be getting long sentences, but they are going to be getting out. So we really better be sure as a nation that we're prepared to receive those people back into society in a way that minimizes the chances of them in re-engaging in the violent activity. In the traditional crime space, recidivism, that is the tendency to recommit a crime, is really quite high for violence. We need to do everything we can to avoid that in the terrorism space.
Well, and those average lengths of sentences just keep going down.
And yeah, interestingly, yeah.
A couple of years ago for ISIS, it was just over 12 years. Right. And part of that is good law enforcement. The earlier law enforcement intervenes, often shorter the sentence may be. But you're absolutely right, Richard. We need to have processes in place to help those individuals reenter society in the most productive ways possible. And Tony, you and I, obviously, a lot of our work is much earlier in the process. In fact, it's considered primary prevention, where individuals may have never even consumed extremist content intentionally. But I know a lot of the students who participate in our program have been exposed, and that's part of why they're so motivated to participate. So that's a primary prevention approach that is really for the general public. So, all right. How can we take the initial successes that each of you mentioned and that you're finding in your programs and actually take them to scale? Because this is the biggest challenge. It's the challenge Congress always asks me. We've got these bright spots of prevention across the country. How do we actually take them to scale? And Tony, I'm going to let you start on this one. And we'll probably go Tony, Richard, Vidhya.
Great, thank you. One of the pleasant and wonderful unanticipated consequences of this academic partnership model was to see the genuine enthusiasm and passion of young people to continue on with their projects after they've been given a grade and the semester has ended. So we saw this happen starting in the spring of 2015, and organically, the students would continue on, and in time, some became 501c3s, nonprofits, NGOs, centers of excellence, and even university-funded programs that continue on to this day. So sustainability is happening. Now, we have had domestic universities, University of Mass Lowell, Central Oklahoma University, who have been awarded DHS grants for continuation and sustainability, which is fantastic. In our European programs, we have some that have received EU grants. Some are for-profit companies now that have developed technology tools that are very popular in the marketplace. But one of the things that we're absolutely delighted with between the McCain Institute and EdVenture Partners is in this current arrangement with the Department of Homeland Security, we actually have sustainment dollars. Because when you think about this, the distributive power of thousands of tech-savvy millennials who know their communities, and you resource them beyond the 15-week semester, magic happens. So built into the program, this current spring semester, we will have teams that think they have the sort of campaign that's worthy of sustainment dollars. Now, this is completely independent of those that just want to organically continue on. So we're putting as much talent into the pipeline to continue on with sustainability. And one of the things that we're just delighted about is you have those 2 tracks that explain the international relations poli-sci majors. Then you have the marketing, advertising, comms majors. Well, the latter had never really thought about careers in prevention. This is their opportunity to taste, try, sleep, eat, drink, making social impact in their communities. And they love it. So the program has been able to really operate on a number of different cylinders with those that want to see it as a career and others that said, I love doing this. I think I want to continue on doing it. So sustainability is something that we're just delighted is a absolutely built-in element to the program right now.
And so, Tony, you addressed sustainability. And then when we think about the other S here, it's scalability. It's getting to more schools, right?
Correct.
And sustaining these programs so they can reach a broader audience and scale over time as well. So I'm really excited. We're hoping to expand into high school in the fall. And there's kind of infinite expansion opportunities there. Richard, your work is so specialized and so localized in terms of the partnerships and the trust you've been able to build with local partners in your region. How do you take a model like yours to scale?
So I'm actually lucky because there is a pre-existing infrastructure that can help us take this to scale. That is, every jurisdiction in the United States, in one way or another, it's touched by either a local police department or a local U.S. Attorney's office, or a local prosecutor, or the Bureau, the FBI has some presence. So that gives us an existing infrastructure. Our challenge, and we fully embrace this, is to show that this program works, and we're in the process now of doing pilots and evaluation, and then convincing probably prosecutors mostly in different jurisdictions that this is a perfect tool, this program that we've created. It's a perfect tool for them to use to help with those cases where they're concerned about the person, but they don't know what to do with the person. That's the dangerous spot here. If somebody comes into the law enforcement umbrella, but law enforcement does not have an adequate response to that person, and that person ends up getting released without any intervention, that becomes a danger. So I think prosecutors see that and they're looking for an intervention. So our scalability is a tad easier, I think it's quite easier than Tony's and Vidhya's, because we do have that infrastructure. The second issue of scalability that I have, which is not as easy, is we are about to take our program and start pushing out into the community, both in the virtual world and in the physical world. That is going to raise a need to train, as many people on this call and many others are doing, a vibrant network of mental health providers out there that are ready to absorb these sorts of cases, who are trained to understand the differences between regular emotional issues and emotional issues that indicate a movement towards extremist violence. They are different. The indicators are different. So we are going to have to engage all of us, have to engage in a big effort to set up that network. We are now starting to do that in the greater New York region, and then we'll be spreading out into central New York State for various reasons, get that moving, and then we'll have to keep moving that out. That is going to be a challenge, but this issue, fortunately, is following the same track that the violent crime issue, the crime issue, not the violent crime issue, followed, which is within the last 10 years, there has been a growing recognition about the intersection between mental health and what we might call traditional crime, and government and the mental health profession have responded vigorously to that. I'm now establishing relationships with mental health clinics that work in the traditional space to get them to expand their reach into this space, because I'm all about not reinventing the wheel. I want to use whatever existing infrastructure is out there, and that looks like the way we're going to go. So it'll be pre-existing mental health clinics or mental health workers that deal with individuals that are already engaged in the criminal justice system, and just get them to take the next step, which is to understand that we can successfully intervene against this sort of behavior and stop it.
And Richard, I know those challenges of building those partnerships and expanding that network well, as you and I work together on building the Prevention Practitioners Network too.
You know it probably better than anybody else, if I may say.
So Vidhya, you've already reached greater scale than I will admit I ever thought was possible. How do you think about scalability going forward?
Yeah, I love questions about scale, because when you're doing work online, there's just so many opportunities to scale programs. The internet is all about scale. So we've worked really hard to build the technical infrastructure for scale in the delivery of prevention and intervention programs. And a lot of our methodologies are really based on the repurposing of tools that were built for commercial purposes. So, I mentioned digital advertising. These are tools which big brands use to get us to spend more money on their products. So these are commercial tools that were fundamentally built to facilitate scale for corporate purposes, to reach millions of people with personalized messaging. So from a counter-extremism perspective, we have the technical infrastructure to ensure that every individual engaging with hate online and across America is offered personalized, localized interventions and connections to services. And I mean, Brette, when you mentioned scale, that many of us couldn't even imagine, in the last 7 months alone, our ads to reach people engaging with extremist content online were seen over 100 million times. So over 100 million times, audiences engaging with extremist content across America saw our counter content. Now, the main limitation for us, that's obviously scale. The main limitation for us in scaling this kind of work is finding the right locally relevant content and the right organizations at the local level that are equipped to engage with these audiences. Time and time again, and this actually applies even to the commercial advertising space, big brands try and localize their messaging when they're trying to get you to buy products. It's, people tend to consume things and engage with things that are relevant to them, that they can see in their community around them. So what we need is organizations that are creating locally relevant content, digital content, or organizations who are ready and equipped to receive those referrals locally. And this is something I'm really hopeful that will change over the coming years as the US government is increasing funding to local NGOs and community organizations, and as initiatives like those that you're working on, Brette, the Practitioners Network, are going to continue to build their capacity to engage with audiences at risk of violent extremism. I'm hopeful that over the coming years, for us as an organization, that we can find audiences online, we can find anyone who's posting extremist content online across the whole country. We just need the partners on the ground to direct them to. And I'm hopeful that over the coming years, we're going to be able to create those connections even more than we're able to do today.
I hope so too. Now, this is the Sedona Forum, and a lot of our audiences are lawmakers. So forgive me when I ask their favorite question that they always ask me, which is, how do you know if prevention programs work? Richard, you used the favorite word, evaluation, a moment ago. Tony, I know you and I are partnering on an evaluation application right now. And Vidhya, I know Moonshot is all about measuring the impact of your programs. So we've only got a couple minutes left here. Who wants to jump in and just—
I'll jump in. My answer is
working. Go for it.
My answer is quite succinct. This is a very complicated area, and I completely understand the skepticism about them because it is hard to measure prevention. The way we do it is we benchmark those emotional drivers that exist in one of our participants that are most likely to lead them to engage in a violent act. And then over the course of the therapeutic intervention that we apply, which again can be 6, 12, 18 months, we keep measuring those benchmarks. And when those behaviors have changed, when they've been reversed or they've been neutralized, we know we've succeeded, and we consider that a successful intervention.
In our program, students are required to do pre and post research. So we do have it from each of the campaigns. Recently, Harvard University finished up a 3-year longitudinal study on 2 of our programs, and the research indicated that the campaigns that the students developed were shown to impact increases in levels of tolerance. So we have some, Harvard-backed data, which obviously we're very pleased and proud of.
Vidhya, last word here.
Well, the beauty of working online is that there's a lot of data to work with to assess impact. And sometimes we're actually really humble in our objectives with a project. Sometimes it's as simple as taking someone who was hoping to watch hate content online and measuring the number of minutes that we got them to watch a safer alternative. So sometimes we're really humble in what we're trying to achieve. But I acknowledge that that doesn't really tell us whether we've actually changed that person's mind or even had long-term impact. So increasingly, as we're increasingly linking people in, not just to a static video or something that they'll watch as a one-off, but linking people into services and something they can engage with in an offline setting, this opens up a whole new possibility to understand how engagement online can contribute really to long-term change in an individual.
Well, thank you all for the phenomenal work you're doing and for the partnerships across all of our organizations in really tackling this challenge and preventing future attacks on our democracy.